What happens when exams are cancelled and instead an algorithm is used to calculate student grades? The UK has experimented with this recently and it has been an absolute catastrophe. Let's have a look. I happen to be an undergraduate admissions tutor in law, and I've been dealing with some of the fallout over the last couple of weeks. It has been chaotic and deeply regrettable. The situation is essentially this: students in England typically sit 3 A-level exams when they are 18 years old, and the grades that they receive are used for entry into university. The problem was that A-level exams had been cancelled by the government, and the government had instead come up with an alternative system for calculating the grades of these students. The scheme had 2 main elements. Firstly, teachers were asked to make careful predictions about the results that they thought their students would have achieved had they sat these exams as normal. And then number 2, these predictions were passed to an external regulator that had developed an algorithm to make sure that the teachers were not being too generous in the predictions that they had made. The idea behind all of this seems to be that the scheme was supposed to deliver a robust set of grades, a reliable set of grades, that in terms of the distribution was also in line with what had been achieved in previous years. So the number of B grades or C grades achieved across the country and at different schools was roughly in line with what had been achieved in previous years. As it turned out, however, the scheme, and in particular the algorithm, was deeply, deeply flawed in terms of the grades that were being produced. And there were all sorts of cases of individual injustices for individual students, but also for schools who had been treated very badly by this particular scheme, and in particular the algorithm. We know that the education system in the UK is a deeply unfair system. There are structural inequalities in the system that mean that some students from some backgrounds and who attend certain schools achieve much more highly in their grades than students from other backgrounds and other schools. What the government did with the scheme that it introduced, and in particular the algorithm that it was pushing for, the idea was to reproduce, to replicate results, A-level grades that had been achieved in previous years. In other words, the government, through direct intervention in 2020, was looking to reproduce and replicate the structural inequalities that exist in the education system and that are well known. In fact, it gets even worse. The way in which the algorithm was implemented actually amplified some of those inequalities, as has been well reported in the media. This is why I think the government finds itself in such a difficult position, and rightly so. It's one thing for the government to say, well, the education system that we have is problematic. Yes, there are inequalities, and we are working on them. We're trying to address them. But what happened this year was that the government intervened, and the scheme that was adopted was one that replicates, reproduces those very inequalities, and in some ways amplifies them further. The government has now been forced into a U-turn, and what it has done is essentially set aside the imposition of the algorithm. So if a student instead wishes to rely on the teacher-based predictions of their A-level grades, well, those are the ones that the student can use. From the university point of view, universities were required to make decisions based on the A-level grades that had been produced by the algorithm in the first instance. Now the government has U-turned, and we are now looking again at some of the other cases that have come to us. But this puts students in a very difficult position as well as universities, and the government U-turn has absolutely not dealt with, addressed all of the problems that have arisen in this very sorry saga. More generally, the education system needs fixing, and that was made stark in certain ways by this algorithm that was used. At the same time, the education system is not isolated. It is not hermetically sealed from wider society. It is connected to wider society. So the extent to which we can successfully address structural inequalities within the education system will also depend on the extent to which we can plausibly and successfully address some of those inequalities in wider society as well. And the question for the government is, what is its strategy? What agenda is it pursuing? What has it made clear about how it is actually going to address some of these deep inequalities? Another thing to think about here is that this sorry saga has dented public confidence in the use of algorithms by the state. There may be certain ways in which algorithms, when developed properly and carefully and rigorously and openly, can be very effective, can help us socially in certain ways. And that will depend on the quality of the algorithm, where it's being used, and the quality of the data that is being injected into the algorithm. So there is a lot to answer for here. And speaking as an undergraduate admissions tutor, this is a deeply unimpressive state of affairs that has been created. Thank you for watching, and good luck to all those students out there who are thinking about their next steps. Take care.